26th of January 2022.
We do it on this day when the course of this land changed forever. There is no escaping or cancelling that fact.
Thousands rallying to change the date.
From news.com.au.
I'm Andrew Bucklow, and I've got news for you. Well, on this very day 233 years ago, British Royal Navy officer Arthur Phillip rowed ashore at Sydney Cove, which is now known as Circular Quay. He raised the Union Jack flag, toasted to the King's health, and proclaimed British sovereignty over part of the continent. Those events all those years ago are partly the reason why Australia Day is celebrated on January 26th. But fast forward to now, and a growing number of Aussies agree that January 26 is no longer an appropriate day to celebrate our country. Instead, it's viewed as a date that signifies the way Indigenous people had their land stolen from them, and which saw hundreds of thousands of Aboriginals killed by colonists. In today's episode, we'll take an in-depth look at why the date of Australia Day should be changed, and how to convince those who aren't on board yet why it simply has to happen. Joining me now is Shannon Dodson, a Yawuru woman who is co-chair of the National NIDOC Committee. Shannon, thanks for coming on I've Got News for You.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so what does the date of January 26 represent to Indigenous people, and why should Australia Day be moved?
I think it's important to understand that January 26 for many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people really represents the day in which life changed forever. Mm-hmm. It's when trauma for our people started, because what January 26 actually is when the first fleet arrived. That was really the beginning of genocide of Aboriginal people, the dispossession of our lands, and all the terrible things that have happened to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people throughout history that are still being felt today. So I think that it's hard for people. They often think, oh, well, just get over it. That was so long ago. Let's just celebrate who we are today. But the point is that we can't celebrate who we are today if we don't rectify some of those things that happened. There was no treaty made with Aboriginal people from the get-go. The land was literally stolen from Aboriginal people. So I think that that's why it's a hurtful and painful day for a lot of Indigenous people. It's really that representation of what was a traumatic experience that continues to be felt by generations today.
Is this something that you would say your community feels really strongly about?
I think that in terms of the sentiment around Australia Day, there is definitely a widespread support for changing the day that we celebrate Australia. People often refer to January 26 either as Invasion Day, as they see that as the day in which these lands were invaded and taken from Aboriginal people. People often refer to it as Survival Day, which is looking at as though we have survived all these years, even after all the devastation. And people call it the Day of Mourning, which is what it says is that about mourning what has happened in our history and mourning for our ancestors and the people who have come before us. And there's also now a sentiment of abolishing Australia Day altogether, which is basically the feeling that how can we celebrate our country when there is still so much disadvantage and trauma experienced by Aboriginal people today. There is still no treaty with Indigenous people, and I think that is something that is felt amongst a lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So I think the sentiment of changing the day is something that's picked up momentum more and more. And let's remember that Aboriginal people have been protesting the actual date of January 26 for decades, since 1938. So it's not like this is a new idea of, not wanting to celebrate this specific date. So I think that, as a country, if you have the first people saying this is a hurtful date, it represents something really terrible for us, it needs to change. I don't see why we couldn't change it to a different day that would be more inclusive of all Australians.
Well, speaking of that, is there an alternative date that you'd like to see Australia Day celebrated on?
And, I think there are a lot of different ideas that people have when it comes to potentially changing the date. I think there's been the idea of once there is a treaty amongst Indigenous people in Australia, that could potentially be the day that we celebrate Australia Day. There's also the sense that potentially when we become a republic, that's when we could celebrate Australia Day. There are other dates that have been thrown around, but I think at this stage it's more the idea of moving away from that specific date that represents so much harm and sadness. And I think that we do have the opportunity as a country to really start to deeply listen to Aboriginal people when we're saying this is hurtful, to listen and to have those uncomfortable conversations.
What is something for every non-Indigenous person who is listening right now, what is something they can do on Australia Day to be good allies for those in the Aboriginal community?
So there's now a lot of different events that you can go to in Sydney. I'll be attending Yabin Festival, which is a celebration of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures. There's Invasion Day rallies, which some unfortunately have had to be cancelled due to COVID, but there are other ones that are happening. If you Google it or go on social media, there is always events happening all around the country that you can get involved in that is about actually immersing yourself within the Aboriginal community and finding out what this day represents. But I also think that, it's not just about showing up to rallies, and it's also about having those uncomfortable conversations with people, because it's not just up to Aboriginal people to continue these conversations. Non-Indigenous people need to have those really hard conversations with their family, with their friends, because often that's how you do change the minds of people. If they're hearing it from somebody that they respect or value, they're more likely to start to think about things differently. So I think that's also a really big thing. And even some businesses are moving towards actually working on the public holiday. So my workplace, for instance, we have offered for people to work tomorrow and then take a day in lieu that isn't on January 26th.
Yeah, right.
So there are some businesses that are now moving towards that as well, and using that day as a day of reflection of really understanding why it is that this is a hurtful day to celebrate Australia.
Now, news.com.au recently conducted a panel with a group of young people from around the country to ask them what Australia Day meant to them. Joining me now to discuss the results is news.com.au's youth editor, Karsha Burns. Karsha, firstly, who are the people that you interviewed for this panel?
Hey, Bucky. So we had some really interesting Gen Z voices, and each of them had a pretty unique experience of Australia Day growing up. So first of all, we had Nick, who is First Nations, but he grew up in the foster system. So his grandparents are white, which for him meant that he grew up with like the typical Australia Day barbecues and such. And it really wasn't until he was a teenager that he began to understand the history of his people in relation to the day, which led to some pretty interesting family conversations for him.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah, and then we had Amani, whose family immigrated to Australia when she was young, so they really didn't have much connection to the actual day other than just being happy for a public holiday and doing your typical public holiday thing. Again, for her, it was kind of until she grew up a bit and became more educated on the issues that she kind of started changing what she did on the day. And then finally we had Angus, who never had much emotional connection to the day at all. And basically just sees it as a day to take a shift, if at all possible, to get a better pay rate.
Yeah, love those public holiday pay rates. All right, well, talk to me about what the main takeaways were from their responses.
So overall, the feeling was quite unanimous that the date does need to be changed. And it seems like that's quite a common sentiment among Gen Z. Obviously, this is mainly due to the pretty horrific history of Australia's colonisation and how Indigenous people were treated. And as someone with no emotional connection to the day, Angus actually made a really good point that we can have a listen to.
I think it's as simple as if you have something that's causing distress to a large enough population of your country or whatever it happens to be, why not change it? It's that simple.
If your only argument for January 26 is that we have done it forever this way, therefore we are not going to change, then that's not a good enough argument when you contend that against, a history of suffering, of oppression, of degradation, dispossession.
Yeah, so we heard Amani in that as well. So both of them just couldn't really understand why it wouldn't change if it doesn't really matter to them, but as a whole group of people who care a lot about it.
Yeah, which is a very valid point. I mean, why go ahead with this public holiday if it does upset a very important part of our community?
Exactly. It just seems like that's an easy thing to do in life. If there's a group of people that are saying something upsets them and it's easy for you to stop, why wouldn't you stop, no matter what it is?
Yeah.
So then, obviously, more recently, talk around changing the date has also turned a bit to an abolish the date talk. So I was curious what they thought about that, and there wasn't really any set agreement on which way to go with this. But everyone did agree that Australians care a lot more about getting a public holiday than actually needing that public holiday to be Australia Day, which is totally fair because, right now, I don't do anything on Australia Day out of respect, but it's annoying to have a day off that you can't do anything with, so change the date.
Yeah.
So basically whether the date was moved or kept a public holiday and called something else entirely, all the panelists agreed that people wouldn't really care once it was all said and done.
Yeah.
And then they also made a really interesting point that even beyond Indigenous issues, there's still a bit of a problem with Australia Day because it's still, the whole idea of Australia Day is like, oh, it's Australia Day, so throw a snag on the Barbie. But that's pretty out of date and doesn't really reflect the multiculturalism and complexities of Australian society in the modern age. So Amani particularly was saying, I don't have a connection with the day. That hasn't been part of what my family does. So it does just feel like the day as a whole isn't really resonating with Gen Z.
Yeah, I mean, the whole, shrimp on a Barbie, snag on a Barbie, it's very Paul Hogan 1980s, isn't it? Like the idea of us sitting around having a barbecue, drinking a Foster's. Never met an Aussie who drinks a Foster's. No, you're right. It doesn't quite feel right anymore. Yeah,
honestly, that was something that I hadn't even fully thought about, but when they said it, I was like, of course, this what is an Australian, It's pretty hard to define at the moment. And then I just, so the last thing that I wanted to know from them was whether it felt like it was at all possible to celebrate Australia Day respectfully with everything exactly as it stands right now, or whether it's just always going to be racist to do that. Okay. And as you'll hear, the answer was very much unanimous.
No, I don't know that requires elaboration. I don't think so.
Yeah, so Angus was pretty blunt there. He doesn't really see a way that you can celebrate Australia Day on January 26 without it being a little bit racist.
Yeah, exactly. And the other two were very much in agreement. And when I did sort of push them to explain their thoughts a little bit more, they kind of explained that they felt that the only way that you could possibly celebrate Australia Day without racism would just be through complete ignorance. So if you just come over from another country or something, maybe it could be excused. But at this point, there's not really any excuse for Australians to be ignorant on the issues surrounding it. So basically they felt that celebrating is willfully ignoring the very real and very deep distress of a large portion of our people. So just prioritizing your own ability to have a barbecue and ignoring everyone else is pretty racist.
Yeah, probably not on anymore, is it? Kasia, thank you so much for taking the time to run us through those responses. Really appreciate it.
No worries. Thanks for having me.
All right, let's be honest. January 26 is a divisive day. A lot of Aussies see it as a day that represents the beginning of institutionalised inequality against Indigenous people. And then there are some who reject that and are perhaps unwilling to acknowledge the impact of colonisation on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Now, these two opposing views can lead to disagreements, especially on a day like today when there's usually a lot of booze involved. So how can you have a respectful conversation with someone who doesn't think the date of Australia Day should be changed? Joining me now to answer that question is workplace diversity expert Noreen Young. Noreen, thanks for coming on I've Got News for You.
Absolute pleasure, Andrew.
Okay, so what would your tips be for how we can have a respectful conversation with someone who doesn't agree with changing the date?
I think we have to appeal to their sense of decency and fairness. Because I think it's better to fundamentally view all people as good. And I think you need to ask them why it's so important to them and go through the arguments, which are, for starters, it hasn't always been the date. The date has changed a lot of times, so one more time isn't going to make that much difference. And why would you want to hurt anyone?
Yeah.
It clearly symbolises for Indigenous people the beginning of the loss of culture and language and really importantly land. And so it's hurtful. And why would you want to deliberately hurt anyone, I think, is a question that needs to be asked more generally when it comes to racism. You wouldn't want to hurt your mum or your sister or brother or the person you love most, and you don't want to hurt your friends. Why do you want to hurt people you don't know?
Now, when you are having discussions with people about why it's important to change the date, if they continue to disagree with you and say no, I'm assuming it's probably not a good idea to accuse them of being a racist during a discussion. Would that be fair?
Oh, look, I've been in professional situations where I've been doing work and professionally we've called something out as racist in the workplace and people have got themselves into all kinds of a tizzy about behaviour being labelled as racist. So I think it's important to remember that it's not worse to call racist behaviour racist if it is racist than the racism itself, right? And I think that is really problematic. People tend to think of racism as very direct, overt acts of racism like segregation in a movie theatre or slavery, that people pretend we haven't had in this country, for example. So I think you need to gauge it. If the person's being racist, then call it out. And I've got to say, the comments I see on social media, and, always advisable not to look at them, but I have looked at a few on Facebook in particular over the last couple of days, and the anti-change the date or the anti-even think about it or have a discussion comments have all been pretty racist from what I've seen. So right. I don't know.
Is there any point when you're having these discussions that you should perhaps abandon the discussion? Because, this is a touchy subject and every now and then things are going to get heated.
Yeah, I think that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and people of goodwill need to protect ourselves at this time of year, and so if it's getting nasty and personal, and racism can never not be personal. I think if it gets like that, then I think you need to abandon it, because it goes down to that hurt and damage and trauma thing again, doesn't it? Where you're placing yourself in that situation, and who wants to do that?
Well, that's all we've got time for in today's episode. Now, if you are going to some sort of Australia Day celebration today, no judgment, but just do me a favour, okay? At some stage, just take a very brief moment to stop and reflect on our nation's history, okay? Alrighty, I'll catch you later.